For Dan Smoker, this was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Months of planning, 6 tickets booked, a summer vacation in Europe with his family, the kind of getaway you remember forever. But all it took was one announcement at the airport to flip everything upside down. Engine issues, flight canceled. Suddenly, the trip they'd been looking forward to was gone before it even started. Now, anyone who's had a trip canceled knows the panic that sets in. You've got hotels booked, tours scheduled, kids excited and restless, and thousands of dollars on the line. Multiply that by 6 tickets, and you've got a full-blown crisis. For Dan, it wasn't just about missing a vacation. It was about making sure his family didn't lose everything they had put into this trip. So he did what anyone would do. He called United Airlines directly, hoping to get rebooked fast. After all, airlines handle cancellations every day. Surely someone on the other end of the line could fix this, maybe even put them on another flight within hours. Dan wasn't angry, just stressed. The kind of stress where you're willing to spend hours on hold if it means your family gets back on track. But this wasn't going to be a normal customer service call, because what started as a routine phone conversation to save a vacation was about to turn into one of the strangest and most expensive scams you've ever heard. And the craziest part? Dan didn't dial the wrong number. He actually called United directly. When Dan picked up the phone to call United Airlines, he felt a sense of relief. Sure, the vacation was hanging by a thread, but at least he was doing the right thing. He hadn't clicked on a sketchy link. He hadn't dialed some random number from the internet. This was United, the airline he had actually booked with. If anyone could help, it was them. The first representative he reached was polite, professional, and sounded exactly like you'd expect from a major airline. Dan explained the situation. 6 tickets, a canceled flight, a family stuck in limbo. The rep listened, reassured him, and said they'd do everything possible to get things sorted out. For a while, it felt like progress. Then, after a few minutes, the rep told Dan he was being transferred to another department that could handle rebooking on different airlines. No red flags, just standard procedure. Dan was grateful. Maybe this would be faster. On the other end of the line came a new voice. Calm, confident, professional. The man introduced himself as David, another United representative. And right away, David seemed prepared with solutions. He sympathized with Dan's situation, walked him through the available options, and suggested a rebooking that sounded too perfect to ignore. Flights for the whole family on another carrier that would still get them to Europe on time. Finally, some hope. But there was one catch: the cost. David explained that these new flights would require a charge of $17,000. A jaw-dropping number, but in the heat of the moment, Dan focused on the urgency. He had 6 people depending on him, and this was United Airlines telling him it was the only way forward. Hours went by on this call, now 3 of them in total, and the longer it went, the more legitimate it felt. Every detail, every reassurance, every confirmation email David promised made it seem like the problem was being solved. Dan had no idea that with every passing minute he was being pulled deeper into a scam that had slipped in through the last place he expected: United's own phone lines. From the moment David laid out the plan, it all sounded believable. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't aggressive. He spoke with the calm confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. That's exactly what made it convincing. He told Dan that because the original flight had been canceled due to engine issues, United could arrange alternate tickets on a partner airline. It would be complicated, sure, but they could still get the whole family to Europe. The problem was the price tag: $17,000. At first, Dan hesitated. That's the kind of number that makes you stop and think twice. But David had an answer ready for everything. He said these were premium seats available last minute, and that United would refund the cost once the original tickets were processed, and that it was the only way to keep the family's vacation alive. He even emailed Dan a confirmation, complete with the right logos and formatting, making it look official. For Dan, it was a nightmare scenario. 6 people depending on him, the family's once-in-a-lifetime vacation on the line, and no real way to fact-check what he was being told. The clock was ticking, and David reminded him that seats on international flights don't last long. The pressure was subtle, but it was there. Act now or lose everything. So Dan agreed. Over the course of a 3-hour call, he followed every instruction. He gave payment details. He sat through hold music while David claimed to be working on the booking. He listened as David confirmed their new reservation, and by the end it seemed like everything was finally fixed. The $17,000 charge showed up on his credit card, but that was expected. The important part was that the family's trip was saved, or so he thought. But when the dust settled, no new tickets ever appeared. The promised reservation never went through. The only thing that was real was the charge to his card. Dan didn't know it yet, but he hadn't been speaking to United Airlines at all. He had just handed thousands of dollars to a scammer who had slipped into his life through the most unlikely door: an airline call center. After that marathon phone call, Dan hung up, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. It hadn't been cheap, but at least the trip was back on track. David had assured him everything was set, and the email that arrived afterward seemed to back it up. A detailed message describing the reservation, the charges, and even outlining the refund process. It looked polished, official, exactly like what you'd expect from a major airline. But as the days passed, little cracks began to show. First, the new reservation never appeared in United's system. Then the promised refund didn't arrive. When Dan reached back out by email, David responded quickly, explaining that refunds often take time and that he just needed to be patient. It was the kind of explanation you hear all the time with banks and airlines, so Dan brushed off the worry. Weeks later, though, nothing had changed. The $17,000 charge was still sitting on his credit card. The refund email had become nothing more than words on a screen. And no one at United seemed to know anything about the David he'd been speaking with. Still, the thought that he'd been scammed didn't quite click. After all, he'd called United's official line. He hadn't gone hunting for some sketchy website. How could this not be real? It was only when Dan finally called United again, determined to get answers, that the truth began to unravel. This time, the representative on the phone looked deeper into his account. They couldn't find any record of the rebooking. They couldn't find any trace of the $17,000 transaction. And when Dan mentioned David's name, the rep was puzzled. That was the moment the ground shifted. Because what Dan thought was a frustrating but normal delay was actually something much darker. And when United investigated what really happened, the truth left everyone stunned. When United Airlines finally dug into Dan's case, what they found was so bizarre it almost sounded impossible. Dan hadn't misdialed. He hadn't fallen for a fake number posted online. He had done everything right, and still ended up trapped in a scam. Here's what actually happened. The first representative Dan spoke with, the one who had seemed professional and legitimate, really was a United employee. But when that rep tried to help Dan rebook onto another airline, they made a simple mistake. Instead of using internal systems to reach out to partner carriers, the employee apparently Googled the other airline's customer service number. And right there, waiting at the top of the search results, was a fake number, one planted by scammers to look just like the real thing. So, without realizing it, the United employee transferred Dan's call straight into the hands of a fraudster. From that moment on, everything Dan experienced, every promise, every confirmation email, every refund assurance, came from a scammer posing as customer service. And because it all came as a direct transfer from United itself, Dan never had a reason to question it. Think about how twisted that is. Most scams depend on the victim making a mistake, clicking the wrong link, calling the wrong number, or trusting a shady email. But here, the mistake happened inside the company. The very airline Dan trusted accidentally handed him over to the scammer, gift-wrapped and ready to be taken advantage of. When United confirmed this to him, Dan was stunned. It wasn't just a bad stroke of luck. It was a nightmare scenario where even doing everything right still led him straight into a trap. As he put it later, it's one thing to call the wrong number entirely and get scammed. It's another thing to call a trusted source and still get scammed. And if that can happen through a major airline, it raises a chilling question. How many other people might be just one Google search away from the same fate? Dan's nightmare wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem, one that's costing Americans billions of dollars every single year. The Federal Trade Commission has been sounding the alarm about scams like this for a while. Scammers have gotten smart. They don't just send suspicious emails anymore or call pretending to be your bank. Instead, they've taken over the places where people naturally go for help. Search Google for an airline's number, and you'll often find paid ads or fake listings planted right at the top. They look official, they sound official, and once you dial in, you're already in the trap. It's frighteningly effective because who double checks a phone number when you're stressed about a canceled flight or a lost bag? People are desperate for solutions, and that's exactly the moment scammers swoop in. And the numbers prove it. In just the first half of 2025, there were already over 500,000 reports of imposter scams filed with the FTC. The reported losses? A staggering $1.6 billion. And those are just the cases we know about. The FTC admits the real number is much higher because so many victims never report what happened to them, either out of embarrassment or because they think nothing will come of it. What makes this even more dangerous is how professional these scams have become. Fake websites with perfect branding, customer service lines that pick up immediately with convincing hold music, emails that look indistinguishable from the real thing. The days of sloppy scams with bad grammar and obvious red flags are over. These operations are slick, convincing, and designed to catch even the most cautious people off guard. And if United Airlines, one of the biggest carriers in the world, can accidentally connect a paying customer to a fraudster, it shows just how vulnerable the entire system is. But Dan's story wasn't over yet. Because once the truth came out, United had no choice but to act. And the fallout revealed just how messy a situation like this can get. Once United realized what had happened, they scrambled to contain the damage. Their official statement admitted they were reviewing the case thoroughly and working directly with Dan's credit card company to make things right. They called it a debacle and promised a fair resolution. But for Dan, that was little comfort in the moment. He still had $17,000 tied up in limbo, with no guarantee of when or if he'd see it again. The silver lining was that his family did eventually get rebooked on another flight, but that didn't erase the sting of being conned in such a surreal way. Dan did what most people would do. He trusted the airline. He trusted the system. And that system failed him. Consumer advocates point out that Dan at least had one small advantage. He paid with a credit card. That meant he had legal protections to dispute the fraudulent charge. If he'd used a debit card, the money would have been pulled straight out of his bank account, and recovering it would have been far harder, if not impossible. It's a harsh reminder that even the way you pay can determine whether you get scammed out of money forever. United says they're committed to preventing this from ever happening again, but that doesn't erase the larger question. If a trusted airline can accidentally transfer a customer into the arms of a scammer, how safe are any of us? Dan's story isn't just about a canceled vacation or a single bad call. It's a wake-up call. A reminder that scams don't always start with suspicious links or obvious lies. Sometimes they come from the very places we think are the safest. A customer service line, a trusted brand, or even the voice on the other end of the phone. And that's what makes this story so unsettling. Because if it could happen to Dan, it could happen to anyone.